My name's Amy Husk. I'm a property solicitor, particularly specialising in agricultural land and buildings and commercial property. And today I'm going to talk about some particular considerations when you're buying or selling agricultural land and buildings. Establishing the boundaries in any property transaction is really crucial, but it's particularly important when it comes to agricultural land, mainly because there are so many more boundaries to take into account. They're not a regular shape and they're just more complex. So I think it's just really important to walk the boundaries, check all the plans really thoroughly, and for solicitors to really think about it properly, check the land registry and deed plans. There are several ways in which we can check whether there are any restrictions on potential uses of land. One of those is our usual searches that we would do at the beginning of the property transaction, and particularly the local authority search, for example, which would tell you about any planning restrictions or conditions that might apply. But also checking the land registry title and the deeds is really crucial to see whether there are any restrictive covenants which might particularly say that the land is not to be used for a particular purpose, and adjoining landowners may benefit from those covenants and be able to actually take enforcement action if there were any breaches. So it's absolutely crucial for the solicitors to check for those and to be able to check with the sellers of the land whether there are already any breaches or whether your client as buyer may in future breach them by their use of the land. When it comes to buying and selling farms particularly, there can be a variety of different occupiers that might be at the property depending on the particular uses of different aspects of the farm. For example, on the agricultural land itself, you may have people in there farming on the basis of possibly a farm business tenancy or on the basis of an Agricultural Holdings Act tenancy. And it's really important to have sight of those documents and understand who's there and on what basis, because there are security of tenure rights that attach to those tenancies. And so as a buyer, you would obviously want to be aware of what your legal position will be once you've bought the land. As well as the land itself, you've also got various buildings potentially, and I think it's becoming much more common now for farming businesses to diversify. So you may well have other farm buildings that are no longer being used for agriculture and are now being used for alternative business uses by third parties, and those could be business leases, which again could attract security of tenure and entitle those businesses to remain there for a period of time. You've also got the potential of any houses on the farm. If there are cottages, on what basis are those being occupied? And I would just say that not only from a buyer point of view, but as a seller preparing to sell a farm with lots of occupiers like this, it's really important to prepare thoroughly, make sure copies of those agreements are available, or that any informal arrangements are put on a formal basis well in advance to make it more attractive to a buyer and much easier in terms of the sale process going forward. Diversification of farming businesses is becoming increasingly common, and the planning position is something that I would really advise buyers to consider carefully in terms of existing diversified businesses that may already be operating from the farm that you might want to continue, and also in terms of what your future plans are for the land. And so checking the planning history with the local authority, with your solicitor, is really important, making sure that any planning consents that should be in place are in place, what the conditions attached to those are. But also, if you do have future plans for the land, I would really suggest you go to a planning consultant and talk those plans through carefully and to see whether those are really viable from a planning perspective in the future. When it comes to buying and selling agricultural land, we really need to think about whether there are any schemes that the land is already entered into. There may be agri-environmental schemes which may last for several years, and the buyer may need to continue complying with those going forward, and particular warranties and clauses in the contract may be needed to deal with those. There's also basic payment scheme, which although it's being gradually phased out now, may be part and parcel of the transaction if it's been agreed that those entitlements will be included. So it's crucial to just make sure that everyone's fully aware of all the schemes involved and that the legal documentation fully reflects what the parties have agreed in terms of those schemes. Services can be much more complex when dealing with agricultural land and buildings, mainly because they tend to be much more remote, so main services may or may not be in place. There may be things such as water abstraction licenses. There may also be solar panels, for example. There probably isn't going to be mains gas, so how is any residential property heated? Whether regulations have been followed when it comes to drainage, because particularly with rural property, there often isn't mains drainage, and there may be septic tanks or old cesspits, and we need to check whether those are all compliant with up-to-date legislation and regulations. Once you've purchased your agricultural land, thinking about how you're going to run the business going into the future, particularly if it's a family business and other family members are going to be involved, you really must sort of take tax advice and advice in terms of the legal structure to make sure that you put everything in place so that whatever happens, everything is covered and you don't have family members worrying about it further down the line. If you need any further advice when it comes to buying or selling agricultural land and buildings, or you have any other inquiries relating to agricultural property, please do get in touch with me and I'd be happy to help.